The issue of airport slots and their impact on airline operations has always been interesting, and never more so than when the industry gets hit by a global pandemic. In this podcast, we discuss the whole issue of slots with IATA's head of slot regulations, Lara Maughan, as she explains the process and implications of even a minor slot change. Lara also shares with us how the ski slopes resulted in her arrival in Geneva and a very creative way of measurement on runways. Enjoy the podcast. So, Lara, lovely to meet you in Geneva, but how did a lady from England end up in Geneva of all places?
That's a good question. Not because of airlines or airports, actually, or slots for that matter. I actually moved over here for the skiing in the Alps and commuted for a while back to London.
Because there is no shortage of flights between Geneva and London. I mean, in normal times, it's probably one of the busiest routes in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a pick of 10, 12 plus flights a day usually. It's like a bus. And not quite at the moment. No,
I suspect it's probably one or two a day, isn't it, if you're lucky?
Yeah, if you're lucky. I think 0 on some days right now.
Wow, so we're very lucky to capture you then in the IATA office if really what you moved to Geneva for is all about skiing and slopes. So it was just fortuitous, and I guess you needed a job between Monday to Friday before you went back up on the slopes. Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, and I wish life did quite work out like that, and it was all about the slopes, I guess, in the end. But yeah, as everyone in this industry, I think gets bitten by the bug, and there was only so much skiing you could do, and eventually decided that commuting backwards and forwards was taking its toll. So I moved out of the airport planning consulting area and looked for something closer to home if we were to stay out here. And as many people know, IATA's offices in Geneva, are a good home for many people that have worked in aviation, and a role was coming up in airport capacity management, as I thought it was
right
at the time. And it turned out to be in this weird world of airport slots, and the rest is history. I guess that's 10 years ago. So
wow! But your background was airport planning, wasn't it? So you'd already smelt the aviation fuel and were addicted, I guess.
Yes, I think, like many, you get on the apron and you realise what a great industry this is. And after doing lots of moving around and consulting projects, I was keen to get into more of the airline side, and IATA felt like a really good fit. I will admit I knew very little about airport slots at the time when I moved into the organisation, and I was moving in more from a planning and airport capacity point of view.
Mm-hmm. But consultancy experience is brilliant because it just allows you not only to learn the industry, but also to travel the world. You must have worked on some fascinating projects in different parts of the planet.
Yeah, and mainly the Middle East was a real sort of home from home for a while. And I spent a lot of time in Oman as the Muscat airport, the new airport that's now there.
Seeb International, wow.
Yeah, that was my home for quite a few months of the year at times, and was, they're so much fun, these projects, because they're real live projects that you can see building from the ground up. And I miss that in some respects, that project life cycle of starting something and seeing it come to an end. And but lots of travelling and lots of interesting projects, lots of due diligence work for privatisation and working with the banks on these big privatisation projects. Russia and Bulgaria was one that I thoroughly enjoyed. And you get to meet so many interesting people, the architects, the airport planning teams and the operation teams. So it was good times and loads of experience, boots on the ground experience.
And those frightening moments when, as the consultant, everyone looks at you and says, "So what do you think?" And you have to have the answer. That's the defining moment, isn't it?
Yeah, and working with some of the architectural teams, you get such an insight into some of the ways these things come together. And there's some really funny memories of standing on runways looking at cracks in pavements and not having anything to measure it with, and throwing down my shoe with a heel on to measure it. And all the male engineers looking in horror because I didn't have a big biro to measure the crack against.
Nothing if not practical. So tell me, what you're head of slots. So what does that mean? Because what is a slot? It's very intangible.
Yeah, it's and it's something that honestly I don't think that many people had to worry about for a long time, and then in the crisis it suddenly comes to the forefront somewhat. Yeah, a slot is a time on a day when an airline gets to access the runway and the terminal infrastructure at an airport, and under normal circumstances that's the schedule. That's what everyone lives and breathes, the airline schedule, but the slot is the very specific, intangible allocation of that time to the airline that they have to then use and operate up to 80% at least of the season under normal circumstances.
But it is, correct me if I'm wrong, it is more than just the piece of concrete you land on. There's a whole lot of complexity in other parts of the operation that go around just that moment in time, aren't there?
Yeah. It's everything. I mean, at very busy airports, it's every piece of infrastructure that the passenger flows through is precisely allocated to the airline, and the stand availability, the runway availability, everything's part and parcel of that one allocation. So it's a very complex piece of allocation that the coordinator does. And then it's the backbone for the airline. I think people have said the lifeblood, if you like, of the airline is their slot network across the world, and how they match all of those times up into a feasible schedule each season. So it is highly complex for the airlines to manage.
And the perception is, in the general public, that this only happens at busy airports. But from what you're saying, it has implications for nearly any commercial, or potentially any commercial airport in the world.
Yeah, because these slots, even if you're an airline that doesn't, is lucky, I would say, and only has slots on some of their routes, that's so precise in time and often so difficult to move, around one season to the next because of the timings and the congestion that's at these airports. They're having to build their whole schedule out of these times. So it's like having, things bolted in that you have to manage to get the aircraft to fly between. So if you've actually got airports that you operate to without slots, you've got a lot more flexibility than just those hub airports.
And bizarrely, I remember from my KLM days, it would be harder to move a slot 15 minutes sometimes than it would be to move it 12 hours.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah.
And
yeah, if you want to move a slot 12 or so hours out of a peak, you're probably free to do so. If you try and move it 15 minutes in the peak, no chance.
No. Well, I guess that's an easy place to start from. We used to look at our slot coordinators at the airlines, and as they came back, it was almost like watching someone who had achieved a miracle. If they had managed to move that slot, it was akin to parting the Red Sea or something like that. It was such an important part of the airline business.
Yeah, and I think I often describe it as these slot managers in the airlines are like, the best chess players you can meet. They can see all the moves ahead of them before they make the move, and the swaps that take place between the airlines are fascinating to see at the slot conference and things, because they're just doing one-to-one swaps between airlines just to get all their times lined up. They might have taken a new aircraft and they need to shorten the route time. And
bizarrely, very much of it is in their heads, isn't it? You're right. It's like chess. There's lots of software, but a lot of it is just sort of like a switch in their brain that turns them into very logical, systematic people.
Yeah, absolutely. And they'll sit there and they know exactly what they're trying to move. They know where they might get the moves. If they don't get the move on that time, they'll try another airport to get a different move. And the flexibility is really on the ends of the routes where they don't have slots. So if you're a carrier that basically has 100% of your network slot controlled, i.e. your base is at a slot controlled airport, although you've got the flexibility of your whole slot portfolio to move around with, you really are constrained in what you can do. And then on top of that, often, there's no extra availability. So growing is somewhat more difficult when there's constraints on that capacity, and everyone's fighting for that one or two slots that might become available that season.
So how many airports are slotted, for want of a better word? There's thousands of airports, but are we talking about a couple of hundred, couple of thousand? How many are really, really slot constrained and precious?
Yeah, well, officially the number is 190 odd for summer. So it's 199 for summer. We have a few less for the winter season, mainly because in Europe there's actually a lot less coordinated airports in the winter season because it's less congested. Greek islands, summer islands, and things. But yeah, of all of those airports globally, as you say, thousands, only 190 are actually designated as slot controlled.
And how much influence does IATA have over that whole slot coordination process? Because every country has, I understand, its own coordinator, and it has its own rules, or should have its own rules. So is it a watching brief, or is it more?
Yeah, our role is really, I think, has grown over the last decade from being kind of a guardian, if you like, of the slot guidelines and the whole global process that we try and keep maintained so that the airlines have some consistency at all these airports, to really an advocate for maintaining standards and the process. And of course, the season in, season out kind of cyclical basis of slot coordination, one season to the next. We're very much behind that, and we put on a slot conference every season. So every season there's a slot conference that takes place with all the global airlines that come into town for the event. Under normal circumstances, we're busy planning the third conference that hasn't happened in person now for next month. But that event is, it's really crucial, and it's more of a business meetings event. It's not a commercial conference. It's there for the airlines to catch up with each other, but most importantly, have one-to-one, very quick meetings with the slot coordinators for each of the airports, and make these real quick-fire decisions on the slots holdings that they have and whether they can move and adjust them, and then running from the Singapore coordinator back to the Heathrow coordinator to check whether they can make the time on each end of the route change.
It is almost like a stock exchange, isn't it, where people are brokering at either end to get what they need and literally running around the floor.
Yeah, they are, and it's amazing to see 1,000+ delegates, and they're all there solely for the purpose of building feasible schedules, basically, for the next season. And these schedules are usually already on sale. So there's this strange process going on to kind of optimise the slots they have to get them really to work in the most efficient manner they can at those airports. And then for the coordinators there, it's really key to see where any capacity can come out, and offer that to anyone on the waiting list or improve the slot times that carry some sort. So, going back to your question, IATA's role is really quite hands-off. We're not, I've seen, you've seen various reports like IATA allocating the slots. It's so far from it. We are really there as the kind of advocates for the process to be maintained by regulators in a consistent manner, and giving technical support as well as training, and just joining up the whole process from every corner of the world really at this point. So try and partner with our stakeholders, the airports, the coordinators, and the airlines.
Because the regulator is appointed by who? The airport or the airport users? Who actually appoints the regulator? I've seen on many occasions it's a representative of the national airline, and every other airline then goes, oh, hang on a second, is that fair, and is it going to work? But it tends to, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting because it used to be a long time ago the actual airline that divvied out the slots at their base, if you like. So, when we used to have schedules conferences and everyone unrolled their reams of paper to build their schedule on. But, now you can't imagine that, say, British Airways would give out its slots at Heathrow and decide which times everyone gets. So obviously now it needs to be an independent body, not an interested party. That's the key here. So it's not the airport and it's not the airline giving and managing these slot allocations. It usually is an independent body, or it can be, say, the Civil Aviation Authority. But most importantly, as I said, it's not the airport, the airline. For obvious reasons, because they're too interested in where these slots go, and it's not fair and non-discriminatory.
Which is of course what we're all trying to achieve. Now, you have no event. You've tried 3 conferences and they've all crashed because of COVID-19. How does it work? Is it working well in a digital environment, or will you go back to that people-to-people contact and, meetings, or is it going to be digitized forever?
Yeah, I think probably the same answer as everyone trying to deal with these events right now. We can get the bare minimum off the ground. So the actual speed dating meetings, if you like, of the slot world can take place through Teams, and we're coordinating that through one of these virtual platforms. But everyone's thoroughly missing that opportunity to have a conversation, that's not timed to 20 minutes and be able to catch up with their colleagues. So, I mean, let's face it, throughout this crisis, some of these people have been the busiest actually in the airlines, the schedule planning and network and slots team. So, I think there's a real need now for everyone to have some human contact with their peers, and we're really fingers crossed that November can take place. And
where is November?
It's planned for Rome in Italy. And, we're literally fingers crossed. You couldn't make the right decision right now, could you? Where do you put it? You just couldn't.
No.
There is no rhyme or reason why you should pick one destination. So we've had to go with a destination that feels right. It's got the right location. It's got accessibility for everybody. And we hope, is open to travel at that point, at least for a vast majority of the delegation.
Do you know, I'm almost hearing from the head of IATA slots that she will buy every airline delegate a drink when she next sees them in Rome in November.
Absolutely. A good Spanish red or a good Italian red.
A good Italian red.
I know. Wouldn't we all love to have a glass of wine?
Yeah, it would.
Colleagues, right?
Do you know what? If nothing else, it would. The other thing about the airline industry is the camaraderie and the friendships that are created, and I think everyone's missing that as much as the whole event. But you ended up in a situation where COVID came along, and it has destroyed this industry, and it still has. You're not in an ivory tower in IATA. What was the reaction when it began to dawn on everyone that this is not looking good?
Yeah, to me it was really twofold. I was actually coming back off my last international flight at the end of January last year. Obviously didn't know that was my last international flight at the time, and I was coming in from Mexico. Had one of these quick dashes out there to have a meeting about the slot coordination process at Mexico City, and all I had when I turned my laptop on at the end of the flight was wave upon wave of email from airlines saying we can't operate within the Chinese market. It's flowing now into the Asian market as a whole. What are we going to do? It feels like we need to go out and ask for at least slot relief on that end of the route and the other end of the route so that we don't have to operate these flights. There is zero demand right now for these flights. And so the next couple of weeks were spent working with the Chinese authorities and authorities in each other jurisdiction to get those flights alleviated from this 80% use rule. And then, and it felt like much longer, but actually I was just looking, it was only 3 weeks later, the end of February, we suddenly had this realisation that this wasn't just about Asia or China, and the alleviation that we'd got for China and Hong Kong wasn't going to be enough, and it was now very quickly global. And that was really for one reason, the passenger demand had fallen off a cliff edge, and there was just a complete collapse in any forward bookings were being cancelled or moved, and there was no shows going through the roof, and the carriers were saying to us, we've got to get relief on our schedule because we can't operate it.
Because in theory, at that moment in time, the slots could have been taken back from them. You were, on the 80-20 use it or lose it rule, and in a very harsh environment, and someone applied the letter of the law, everyone was going to lose their slots.
Yeah, and it was getting to the end of the season, so this could be make or break for some of the carriers that had, maybe had to make some cancellations towards the latter end or middle of the winter season that hadn't been planned. Suddenly this comes out of nowhere and you've got, 6 weeks of the season left. That would destroy your 80% usage on those season slots. So yeah, it was absolutely essential. And it went through the most senior management levels of the airlines, requesting that we do something around this. And it almost now, you almost can't believe that we had to think about it, very critically and carefully with the airlines, because you don't just go and ask for a global slot waiver out of nowhere.
And presumably, I mean, the other dimension of that was these phantom flights, which sort of became a concern about airlines operating empty aircraft just to try and keep a slot. I mean, environmentally, that was a no-brainer as well, wasn't it? And of course, no airline could afford the cost.
Yeah, and at the time, of course, we thought, this will just go on for maybe the first half of the year, but at least for that first half, all the airlines need to be operating only where there's demand or when it comes back. Absolutely nobody could be financing flights that had very few passengers on it, and the environmental lack of responsibility is very obvious.
Corporate negligence, yeah. So in that situation, you've waived the rules for the first season and you've subsequently had to waive them 2 more times. And it doesn't look good at the moment for the winter when you look at how demand is picking up, does it?
No, we're what are we? We're now in the 3rd season with slot relief, and I will make a distinction that now we're in a season with slot relief and not full waivers everywhere.
Yeah, but
it is still essentially, with the hindsight, this summer season would have been a full waiver for everybody, I think. And then, we're now in that 3rd season. We're in the middle of May, and it's not looking good, as you say, for winter. I think the airlines are all, really hopeful that there will be some kind of recovery over the peak summer period. But the later that the restrictions loosen and are removed, the worse that seems. And winter's not the season to see huge recovery, unfortunately. Airlines make their money in the summer. It's not happening again. The leisure markets are very different in the winter. It's much more reliant on business travel and international travel. And that's just not there. And the indicators are not there that it's going to be rebounding quickly. It's the international sector's really low down still.
Yeah, it's interesting. Eamon Brennan at Eurocontrol described May last week as dead. I mean, it's just, it's a classic Irishman sort of blunt response, isn't it? Your CEO would make a very similar response, I'm sure, and Michael O'Leary certainly has done today as well. But it just, the sense is that we're going to have slot relief into the winter. That would be my expectation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and absolutely agree. May is very much gone, and June, very quickly will go. I think passengers are busy making alternative plans now. The governments have not been upfront with what they're planning to do. And where we sit, of course, in this process is all about planning. So day in, day out, the airlines having to make these really quick decisions about how their schedule will rebuild for this summer still. Mm-hmm. Normally, they're planning their slots already for next summer, and they've already done their plan for winter. Now they're sat here saying, what are we going to do for this winter? And they need to know what the rules are. So I guess no surprise to anyone, we're going to be going out looking for more slot relief. And actually, the slot board, which is a group made up of the airports through ACI World, airlines through IATA and a member airline, and the coordinators have agreed on a set of parameters for the slot relief for winter, and we'll be advocating for that almost immediately now.
Right. But this is a very strange industry, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have all of these airlines who quite rightly saying, this is a horrible situation. And you have a bunch of ultra low cost and low cost carriers in the middle who are saying, give me the slot, this is ridiculous protection. And even further down the line, you have some carriers who are starting new routes or actually launching new services. And it blending all of that and trying to find what's happening and how can you help everyone in that situation must be really difficult.
Yeah, and we do have to, I mean, obviously we're listening to the whole industry when it comes to the SOP process. It's not just about IATA members. We have to work for everybody in this space, because whether you're an IATA member or not, you're still operating at the coordinated airport. And absolutely, there are some opposing views to SOP relief, but I would vouch that they are few and far between. And they're, I feel very comfortable today, sat here, that this position represents 98% of the airlines globally.
It's good sound bites for airline CEOs, isn't it?
Yeah, and we have to remember some of those carriers at the moment that say that they don't need relief. One might not be that exposed to the SOP process because they may be operating to more regional airports. Mm-hmm. But also, they're actually taking advantage of this relief as well right now. They're sat in, particularly in the European scene, they're operating at less than 90%, less than 80% still. And they have done, as Eamon Brennan, I'm sure, has verified. Europe's just stagnated at like minus 65% for months now. So everybody's been impacted by it. And it's easy to make a soundbite out of we oppose, the big network legacy carriers view. But the reality is, they're there in the same depths of this crisis as anyone else.
Mm. So carriers like JetBlue, at one end of the spectrum, lots of noise. They are going to start services to somewhere in London. It looks like it's going to be London Heathrow. But how do they manage to get a slot in today's flexible, fluid environment? Is that a regular slot or is that something slightly different?
Yeah, so it's interesting because JetBlue and as have other carriers have started operating new services, across the US, like a lot of the US airlines have, to new leisure markets and things. But they are going ahead with their launch into Europe, and the UK seems to be the focus. As you say, nobody knows where it will land.
Well, we all have a good idea, but we can't say.
But that same Heathrow Airport has seen a lot of new entrants actually through the crisis, and most of them are operating on ad hoc slots, so they're not these permanent historic slots that the airlines have got slot relief on, but they're the pool of capacity that the airlines get because so many airlines are not operating right now. We think that's a real benefit of having the slot relief, is that you get this pool of capacity to redistribute. And we do recognise, of course, that carriers that have started operating now want to be able to give certainty to the consumers that they're going to be there for a while longer. Mm-hmm. They may want to start selling schedules even into next year. So those ad hoc slots do have a priority attached to them. If they're operated and used, there is a priority to come back the next equivalent season, subject to capacity. But it's the best queue jump you could get, if you like.
It's a Disney fast pass, is it?
Yeah. But
it is interesting because, as you say, it is a fast track, and the reality is that many of the major airlines at these big slot coordinated airports have taken quite a bit of their fleets out, aging aircraft, taken out 380s, whatever it happens to be. So there is likely to be a once in a decade or even a 20-year moment when many of these airports actually do have a bit of capacity, and that's got to be exciting and good for the airlines and the travellers, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's why we've got to be really agile in terms of the slot process, allowing that flexibility to the carriers to match where the demand recovers and what they want to operate. But I think one thing that's interesting through all the discussions going on is all these carriers have retired, X number of their fleet and downsized, therefore they won't need the same slot portfolio. But if international does take that much longer to come back, actually in the meantime they're utilising more slots on the more, the heavier rotation for the regional and short haul traffic. So you use up a lot more slots for a 4-a-day service than you do for one departure of the day out to the international station. And that's one of our sort of guiding principles has been, let's not shape the networks of the future by putting policy or removing the relief too early and making airlines make decisions about their network rather than where the demand is in terms of the schedule. Let the future shape of the networks come from a more recovered state of the industry and not shape that through our policy. And I think that's really vital now, is not to allow, the recovery, say in the domestic or the short haul that may come sooner, flood these airports and then not have access for the more international type of connectivity that you need. And that is going to drive that global connectivity when we come back.
So one of the very interesting things about slots, and, everyone raises their eyebrows, is slot trading or the sale of slots. I remember many years ago a small UK airline sold some slots to a very large UK airline at Heathrow for what for the small airline was a lot of money. And now you even hear just single pairs going for, or were going for, £15 million, £16 million at Heathrow. I mean, those airports are few and far between, and presumably the chances of that happening in the future are going to be less than they were 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think there'll be less airports and less of those huge transactions. And it really is one of those activities that is a headline grabber, but is very few and far between. So, the majority of those 199 airports that are coordinated have never seen the slot trade happen at all. And
I can think of two. I can think of two. Have you? I mean, that would be Gatwick and Heathrow. Are there any others that you could?
There was a recent transaction between Ryanair and EasyJet, we think. There was a transaction where they moved some slots between themselves at Stansted. And in the US, there's a buy-sell opportunity that's, legislated. But in other airports, why would an airline go in and spend these sort of sums when there's a slot pool available? So the airline will always take the slot 2 hours later rather than pay huge sums. And over time, they'll gradually try and build back.
Just move it, yeah. It's fascinating. It is, you get these bigger headlines and you think, wow, how much can they get for a moment in time? It is fascinating. How will this all shape out though in the next couple of years? I mean, what's yours and IATA's predictions about the recovery now? Are we at 2024, 26? When can things get back to normal, do you think?
Yeah, I think everyone's hovering around this 2024 period. Maybe some markets will take that bit longer now. It seems that there's some markets more on a kind of elimination approach rather than reopen and manage. But no one can deny that things keep moving further and further down the road. So we all thought we'd be somewhere else at this point in 2021. For us, international, remains at minus 88% right now. And, that may gain some percentage points this year. Maybe we'll get it up to the lofty heights of minus, 60% by the end of the year. But domestic is coming back in kind of a vibrant way in the markets where there are no restrictions. So, that's why the domestic's recovering well. Australia, China.
US is doing phenomenally well.
And there's lots of new capacity being put into airports there. So the airlines, are flipping around their schedules to match the demand, which they couldn't do if they didn't have the slot relief. But, is that going to be there to stay? They'll have to come back to probably their old network, in the end to serve it. So a lot of domestic flights are to leisure markets, point to point right now. Mm-hmm. The airlines need to rebuild their feeder services to start serving the international connections in the end. So.
It is interesting. I think you've read a blog I've done where, this is what's happened in the US is just a dash for cash. But ultimately, the power of the carriers has to be at their hubs and the hub and spoke networks rather than spoke to spoke networks. That's not going to be sustainable forever.
Yeah. And so, where we've seen these huge bubbles of recovery, it's giving everyone optimism completely. And we can see domestics really coming back where it can. But from our point of view, and I feel a bit like we're always the glass half empty coming from the slots world, because we're always there saying yes, but
yeah.
And I suppose we have to be realistic. You know, as good as this all is right now, it's very few actual markets that are really seeing huge domestic recovery, because a lot of markets don't have that much domestic travel.
No.
So, you know, or Europe, for example, it's an international market, even intra-EU, it's international. So, you know, we're still a long way from being recovered. And I think airlines are saying we're basically seeing what we saw last year again.
And to that point, I mean, if this summer is missed, then, as you said a few moments ago, the winter is useless in terms of creating revenues and building up cash flow. That means everyone's then going to be relying on next summer to start building their reserves again, which puts everyone, you know, another year down the road.
Yeah, and from IATA's point of view, international is going to take that bit longer to recover. So at the moment, we're saying 2 years longer than domestic, and I can see that very much being the case. Whether that shifts a bit in the next few months, we'll have to see. But the loosening of travel restrictions, which, you know, is the best you can hope for, removal of travel restrictions is where we're really trying to get to. It's a long path, and we've got to get passengers back on these aircraft.
Absolutely. So here you are, you're head of IATA slots. Where are you going to be in 3 years' time? You've got a new CEO. That's a 3 to 4 year appointment. Is the next job for you head of IATA? That would be a fun job, wouldn't it?
I think after this, most people just want a long holiday, don't they? Be up on a plane.
Get back on the slopes.
Yeah, let's hope in 3 years' time I'm back on an aircraft flying to the next slot conference. That would be, that's as good as it gets.
It certainly would.
Think, yeah, let's see where things head. But interesting times ahead, and we're all excited to see what direction IATA goes in.
Yeah, should be fascinating. Lara, thank you very much for your time. Great to chat to you. Good luck in trying to get the airline industry going again. And we all know who to turn to if it doesn't quite work out there.
Thanks.